You're listening to The Sacred Sofa, a podcast that explores all things theology and therapy. My name is Grace Brown. I'm a registered psychotherapist, certified Canadian counselor, and owner of Journey with Grace Counseling Services.
And I'm Brad Watson, pastor of Nexus Church and author of the book, A Path Called Compelling. Welcome to The Sacred Sofa.
Greetings, Sacred Sofa listeners. We are smack dab in the middle of summer, and here at the Sacred Sofa, we are gearing up for the fall and some new episodes. In the meantime, we are airing pilot episodes we recorded prior to launching the Sacred Sofa.
Today, we are exploring the tensions we have with faith and God by examining, with fresh eyes, the story of Job. We hope you enjoy. This week, we are talking about the book of Job. I gave a sermon on the book of Job called Wisdom in the Whirlwind. And so we are going to chat about some therapy ideas, questions I think that the book of Job raises for us. So very quick recap. Job is, I believe, a parabolic story that raises the question of suffering. It raises it, though it doesn't really offer an answer. In fact, points out why trying to give an answering, I think, to suffering is maybe a bad idea. But Job's character, of course, is met with disaster, suffering, wealth taken away, loses his children. And so it's a tragic story that sets up, I think the book of Job wants to really get out, how do we talk to God when we're in the midst of suffering? But it raises a bunch of other questions as well. And I thought maybe where I'd jump in with you, Grace, is in the Christian church, there's a quite popular song that comes from the book of Job. And the refrain, the chorus of it is, the Lord gives, the Lord takes away, blessed be the name of the Lord. So it's taken from the lips of Job, who after his first set of disasters, his immediate response is to praise God and say, you know what, Lord gave me some good stuff. Now I've got some bad stuff. Either way, I just need to praise God in all of that. Now, the interesting thing theologically is that this comes very early in the book before he's had any time to process, and his demeanor and the way he's speaking is going to change drastically within the span of a few verses, and the rest of the book is him complaining. But it begins for him with praising God, and as Christians, we've taken these words, turned them into a worship song. But I'm curious, Grace, given the way the book unfolds and how Job eventually is not in that headspace at all about praising God, what do you do in the face of tragedy, suffering, when you maybe encounter people who maybe want to put on a brave face? Do you ever encounter that in therapy?
Absolutely. Absolutely. My experience has been, as humans, both personally as well, is often we're looking to make a meaning of the something, especially when it comes to tragedy, young people, passing away too soon, those kinds of things, or folks that we don't expect to pass away. Whenever there's tragedy and suffering, we want to try to make a meaning of it. And also there's this conflict about not focusing on the negative. I think you've probably heard that phrase so many times. Try to think positively. And there's a concept in therapy we actually call toxic positivity. My slang for it is Pollyanna syndrome. There's a movie back in the early 80s about a girl named Pollyanna, and she always found the positive in everything. It's an old movie, very good movie. I recommend watching it. And she always tried to find the positive in every situation. And, there is light and shadow in all things. And I'll talk about that a bit later in our podcast. But toxic positivity is this idea that, something bad has happened, but we really want to focus on the positive, look for the silver lining in all things. And there may sometimes be a silver lining, but I think it's more our uncomfortableness with acknowledging that we don't necessarily have control. And so we can sort of try to put a brave face on things that are tragic or our own grief and pain. And that actually interrupts the natural process of grieving. It's
Hmm.
a form of suppression, because then we have conflict in our mind with the reality of our situation versus what we're trying to push ourselves to dismiss and ignore.
Hmm. Yeah, I'm intrigued by what you said there. Try to put on the positive face, but maybe what's going on underneath is this almost an existential
Mm.
confrontation with that we don't have control, and some
Mm-hmm.
things that happen in life, there may not be a silver lining, at least immediately, in the context of whatever the tragedy might be. But yeah, there are, we all want to sort of skip towards resolution. And I mean, even those of us who want our best to be sympathetic, I mean, it can be wearisome sitting in grief. You know, we've got a neighbor who just experienced a tragedy recently, and I was struck by one of the comments that they said to me recently. I have no more tears left to cry. They said sort
Mm-hmm.
of a weariness. I've cried, wept so much, and it's
Mm-hmm.
hard to stay there in that space, I think, when you're like, I'm just weary from weeping or weary from being in this space. And I think it's natural for us to want to be like, well, okay, let's move on to the next thing. Let's find the
Mm-hmm.
positive here. But what does that do inside of our heads? You alluded to this briefly, but does it sort of create a bit of a
It's
compartmentalized
mm-hmm.
head? Yeah.
Absolutely. There's this discord in our mind and in our heart and our spirit when we're faced with a reality, but we try to deny the truth and reality. You,
Hmm.
I love how this person was so real in saying, I'm weary of the crying. And I've been there where it's
Mm.
just like, how do I still have tears? And how am I going to come out of this place of sorrow? And,
Mm.
you know, that's real.
Mm-hmm.
The story of Job, that's real. He
Mm-hmm.
experienced real suffering, real tragedy, real loss. And there's no wishing that away, hoping, wishing. It's really a practice of staying in the reality and allowing yourself to process the grief in its natural state. And everyone's going to process grief differently. See, some people just try to keep moving and that sort of thing. But when we talk about joining in community, as you said before, it can be very uncomfortable to be sitting with another person's pain. And
Mm-hmm.
we also have to talk about socialization. Like, I love going to a movie, everything resolved in an hour and a half. If it's
Yes.
Titanic, it's like 4 hours,
Yeah,
but
yeah.
there's always seems to be a resolution. Everything's neatly tied up. And that socialization can seep into things like grief. It's like, okay, I should be at the end of this by now. And a colleague of mine recently said a quote that I really like. She says, grief is like glitter. It never goes away. You ever try to clean up glitter? I know you have young children.
Oh yes, oh yes. It's
Months
always
later, you're
there.
like, there it is, another little piece. And you're always on the, once grief happens, you're always on the path of grief. And it's
Mm,
going to take however long it takes for you, not for it to go away, but for you to be able to carry it in a way that's more manageable over time,
mm,
largely with safe community surrounding you. And
mm.
Job is also a fascinating story about community and their supposed helpfulness.
Yeah, absolutely. That's what I want to dive into. Now, before his friends, his community start speaking, one of the things that I'm intrigued about, because it's so foreign to us, but it is a Jewish tradition. I believe they call it sitting Shiva.
Hmm.
But we're told in the story, so disaster happens. Job again puts on the brave face. Then his community, his friends show up, and the story tells us they spend 7 days, full 7 days in silence,
Hmm.
holding that grief, that tragedy, processing before any words are spoken. Now, the interesting thing is, we'll get to this in a second, they still don't say great things after 7 days
Hmm.
of reflecting.
Hmm.
But there is this period where it's like, no, before anything can be said, there just needs to be silence and processing.
Yeah.
Now, I can't imagine spending 7 days in silence with somebody suffering, so foreign to us. But could you maybe take us into, you hear stories, this has never happened to me, but someone gets in a car accident, there's that initial shock, right? What might processing, taking some downtime, that idea of a week in silence, so to speak, are there things we can do immediately once tragedy hits us, suffering hits us, to sort of get our heads in the right place to start, I don't know, working through things?
I love this part of Job. And you're very correct. It is unusual. Job's friends sitting with him 7 days in silence. So they're hearing him weep and wail. They're seeing him, probably not eating, like I said, each person processes. I mean, I can't imagine the degree of loss he experienced as we read through the narrative. And they're sitting there, hearing it all, feeling it all, so incredibly beneficial. We're socialized to want to run from pain, to want to move our loved one forward because it's uncomfortable to see them in such pain. And we don't want our loved ones to be in pain. But here's the thing, people will eventually get to a solution. They'll eventually come out the other side. What they need is for someone to sit, listen, and validate, and just hold space, sitting in the pain. There's nothing they can actually do. And so they sat. Oh, I love this part. I love this part. And when we choose to join with community, it's going to touch us too. And so I can only imagine what was happening with them as they witnessed Joe's pain. It probably tapped into things that they've experienced and lost, which then they have to remember and reflect. And beautiful
Absolutely
segment of
yes
this story.
it is, and it's there's a turn that happens after this 7 days of silence, but I think there's some real deep ancient wisdom there about processing pain and suffering and just holding space for that. Of course, the 7 days are done. Job breaks the silence, so it isn't the friends that started. Job breaks the silence, and he's angry at God now. He's not praising God. He's angry. He's got complaints. This isn't fair. But what then happens over the course of, and let's be honest, it's a bit of a boring, repetitive read once you get to this part, because all of his friends seem to be saying the same thing. The long and short of it is they have bad advice for him. And they don't say things that are ultimately helpful. Even God, when God at the end shows up of the story, is like, Job's friends, you didn't do so well here. You didn't speak well. I'm curious, because this is something that I think will affect us all at some point. A friend, a neighbor, a loved one experiences tragedy, and maybe you're at the funeral home, you run into them. What do you say? Because the moral of the story here is, Job's friends did not say the right thing. They said some hurtful things. They didn't help. And I know you have run into situations where in the face of suffering, people have said some unhelpful things to people grieving. Is there some wisdom around what to say?
There's so many things here. I feel like we could do a part 2 of this episode alone. But when Job's friends start to speak, what is revealed to me is certain belief systems. One is we're socialized to believe that life has a cause and effect. If you do this, then that. Even in Western culture, folks talk about karma. Right. And, that's shows up for me in their friends saying, well, you've sinned. You must have done something to deserve these consequences. And, so that belief system shows up. Sometimes people's belief system shows up in what they say. I know you and I have talked about this before, when people say things like, God won't give you more than I can bear. And I recently heard that with a loved one who had experienced grief recently. And it's like, so then what's your belief about who God is? And this is also a preview to another podcast we're going to do. It's like, who is this God that is going to rain hell on me? So there's a belief system about your relationship with God and who God is that shows up in the things that people say. The reality is, in life, there's light and shadow. We don't get to run away from the shadowlands. We suffer more when we deny the reality of our situation and the very real possibility that life at times will be hard and even tragic.
Absolutely.
And so sitting with Job in silence, joining him in his grief, very beneficial. Blaming him, blaming God, not really beneficial.
No, absolutely. And it's interesting that you mentioned some of our deep thoughts about God are revealed. And it's troubling sometimes. I think both we were chatting quickly before we started recording here. I've heard of situations, talk to people where losing a child and things like, well, God needed an extra angel in heaven. And it's like, well, wait, if you unpack that, that's a pretty mean God who's going to, or just recently I heard from somebody suffering a deep, devastating loss and someone saying to them, well, I'm sure they're no longer in pain. This person, they're in a place where they're better off. And I can imagine as a parent, say, losing a child, hearing something like that would be just incredibly devastating. So it reveals a bit about the way we see the world, but maybe also that, hey, this silence has gone on too long. This period of grief has gone on too long. Let's find the answer for why this happened so that we can all move on and wrap it up real tidy, right?
And the desire is helpful in terms of you don't want our loved one to be suffering, but ultimately it's not. Grief has to take its own process. There's no shortcut, there's no back door, there's no alley. You have to go through it, and to push our loved one beyond where they are now actually can create more harm, because what it ultimately says to our loved one is, you actually don't care to sit with me here where I am. You want me to be somewhere else, which is more comfortable for you. And, and so being uncomfortable and practicing being uncomfortable with our loved ones in their grief, in their sadness, their rough time in life takes a lot of practice and a lot of intention.
Yeah. And, circling back to what you said earlier about how the world, we can't control it sometimes. And I think that's a real big theme in the book of Job. It actually shows up with Jesus later. But I think when God shows up to speak at the end, what God communicates is a very deep and intimate care for the world. But we're also, I think it's revealed in the book of Job that God does not micromanage the cosmos, and that suffering happens, and it's not a finely tuned machine. And it's interesting because Jesus picks up on this in the New Testament. A group of people come to him about an incident where a tower had fallen down and killed a bunch of people, and their question to Jesus is, did they bring this on themselves? Is this a world of karma? Did they do something to deserve this? And of course, Jesus disavows them of that notion. No, it has nothing to do with that. But I think it's interesting, this action consequence sequence that we kind of want. I see it as us trying to make sense of a at times chaotic world. We want to be able to say, no, I can get my head around what's happening here. But at times there just really is no answer.
Sometimes there just really is no answer. I'm always fascinated with this phrase that people say, things like, oh, it was meant to be, or things happen for a reason. That is the most vague, random.
Right.
What?
Right. What does that mean?
What does that actually mean? We all make choices, and sometimes the choices we make harm others. Absolutely. That's a reason, right?
Yeah,
Someone made a choice and now it's impacting me. And sometimes life just happens. I heard a pastor once say that, in terms of suffering, because people often rail at God. It's like, why didn't you intervene? Why didn't you prevent? And, to your point, God doesn't micromanage the cosmos, but God promised to be with us when the house of cards fall and walks with us among the debris of life that just sometimes happens.
Yeah. And it's interesting when you hear something like, "Oh, that was meant to be," or "everything has a reason." That might offer a measure of comfort. Maybe if I lose my job, or hey, maybe there's an opportunity here. You lose your job, maybe. But when pushed to the ultimate test of suffering, it really just becomes just almost,
it's an empty platitude.
empty and hurtful, actually, because trying to find a meaning or purpose in senseless suffering, I think, is just a futile exercise and can leave you going, what could possibly the purpose of this? And that's precisely, I think, why Job spends a good 25 chapters on he and his friends back and forth, because Job just can't get his head around it. No, this makes no sense. I don't deserve this. Stop trying to, make this a math equation.
So, sitting with a person in their grief and sorrow, incredibly important. Joining with our loved one or those we care about, joining in their suffering, being present with their pain is incredibly important. Moving away from this idea of toxic positivity into another concept called radical acceptance. Radical acceptance acknowledges grief. It acknowledges pain and suffering, says, I don't like it. I don't agree with it. It's not fair. It could be even unjust, but it's my reality. And when we seek to accept radically, or at least face the reality of our situation, then we can move away from suffering. Suffering in grief happens when we refuse to accept the reality of our situation. You talked about job loss, and we don't want to compare people's grief, because that's another thing we sometimes do in society is like, okay, well, you just lost your job. You should be over it in 30 days, or, you know what I mean? Like, but a job loss can mean multiple forms of loss.
Identity,
loss of
sure.
identity, loss of finances, and so on and so forth. And so, this is a reality, and me putting a brave face on it isn't actually accepting the reality of the ripple effect of this initial loss. And so radical acceptance is very powerful in the way of grief. We didn't touch on it too much, and I believe we'll get there in our other podcast, but anger is also an important part of grief, because you're acknowledging not only necessarily the injustice of a particular loss, but underneath the anger, we're going to use an imagery called the anger iceberg. Anger is a secondary emotion. It's pointing to primary emotions under the surface. And when we think of the story of Job, oh my goodness, the pain and sorrow just welling up underneath comes out in his anger, because he's like, I don't understand. And I love the story of Job as well, because God holds space for his true self coming up, his true anguish and pain. And so moving away from toxic positivity into radical acceptance actually continues to help us move on the path of grief in a way that's healthy and holistic and authentic.
You've brought up a few things I want to tag back to you on here, and that's absolutely the anger. Again, 7 days of silence, Joe speaks, and it's primarily anger coming out of him. In fact, one of the commentators I was reading said it's like an X-rated psalm. Like, it's just it is really harsh what comes out of his mouth. Now, he never curses God, but he doesn't even ask for vengeance or anything back necessarily. He just has this anger. And I was thinking, it's one thing, there's certain things that really make us uncomfortable in a room. When somebody's weeping in a room, good night. That, everyone, when somebody's angry in a room, holding space, like, you can just feel a tension in the air. And so, if weeping, anger are part of the equation, those are some of two, maybe the most uncomfortable situations to just sit and make space for. It makes us so uncomfortable being around angry people, and yet that seems to be at least a model that we're seeing here, a challenge for those of us in relationship with grieving people. Absolutely. And in terms of your toxic positivity, I ended the sermon going, the church should be the one place where we don't have to put on the brave face.
Mm-hmm.
And there's all these interesting studies, right? Like, when are we our least authentic selves? And I read something about when you go to a fancy restaurant, a fancy hotel, right? You sort of, hey, I'm going to act the part. I belong here. And so often I think churches have social cues as well.
Yes,
Show
absolutely.
up, do not make it look like you're having a bad week, just show up and let's all do our happy clappy thing and move on. But I really think one space that should allow us, actually therapy would be another space where
That
we
absolutely
can be our true selves. But in terms of community, making space for those who are just really in the thick of grieving.
Absolutely. And those of us who walk the Jesus path specifically, or path of faith and spirituality, when we look at our text, and in our context, it's the Hebrew text, there is nothing in scripture that talks about this toxic positivity that we've been socialized. So our socialization and culture has infiltrated the theology. And we have to be very careful throughout this book of Job and many other accounts in the Hebrew scriptures. There is light and shadow. When we think about Jesus's path, light and shadow,
yes,
and incredible authentic moment in the Garden of Gethsemane. What was that about? It's like, this is the God of the universe who knew exactly what he was going to experience and was like, no, try, maybe there's another way.
yeah. Right. Yes.
And so, we so much want to get to Resurrection Sunday, but we can't get to Resurrection Sunday without acknowledging Good Friday and what happened there. And that's life. We have to be able to acknowledge that sometimes life is terrible and tragic, and then we can celebrate the joy and the triumph, but we can't take shortcuts.
Yeah. You even see that in the Psalms, the Hebrew songbook, how so much of it is that light and darkness. Hey, I'm in a season of celebrating. Thank you, God. This is, things are great, but also so much lament. And life really is always somewhere on that axis, it feels
Absolutely.
like, right? Between great and awful. Oh my.
That's life. That's
life. That's life.
And what makes it worth living, what makes us resilient and strong, is allowing ourselves to be vulnerable and staying in safe community. We cannot live this life alone. In the joy and the triumph, as well as being able to meet our safe community in those shadowlands. So
Absolutely.
important.
Well, wonderful, Grace. I think that probably works for this week. Hopefully we've been able to get into the book of Job with a different lens here, a bit more of a therapeutic lens. And this was all very interesting to me. Always enjoy chatting with you, Grace.
You as well, Brad. I'm looking forward to our next one. God on Trial.
God on Trial. I cannot wait. We'll see you then, Grace. Yes.
All right. Take care, Brad.
All right. Bye-bye.